Good day, everyone. I hope you're doing well. This is Monday, and I am recording lessons for May the 7th, Thursday's classes. So this is number 1 for May the 7th. I hope everyone had a good weekend. I certainly did. It was a fun birthday weekend. I never imagined that a pandemic birthday could be fun, but it was. And I appreciated hearing from you and appreciated your special wishes for my day and my year ahead. I feel very fortunate and blessed that that I had a birthday that I could enjoy because I'm healthy in this time when so many people are not healthy. I think I'm a blessed person, and it was a good weekend all the way around for me. I hope the same for you. So by now, I hope that you have read about the Underground Railroad. If you have not, I would encourage you to stop and to read the article that I sent to you. In a previous lesson, I did some background introductory work for you about the Underground Railroad, so hopefully you've seen that and then read the article. I also sent a video that I think would be enjoyable to you. If you haven't viewed that, you might want to view it after today, because I think it will help to pull everything together for you about this amazing time in American history prior to the Civil War. So let's go back and just do a little bit of review and tie some things together. You know, when we met previously, I talked about the idea of code words, the words that were used as the slaves moved along the Underground Railroad, a certain language that they could understand and communicate with those who were providing safety and freedom. I wanted to let you know, though, that instead of using the word code words, we can also use the word metaphor. The word metaphor, I doubt is new to you. I'm sure that you have studied metaphor in the past. It's a concept that makes more sense when we actually can put it with, with larger text. So sometimes we learn about things and they're outside of context and they don't make a lot of sense, but when we put them in context, they do. So metaphor and code words are kind of similar. And let's just take a look one more time at some of the metaphors then that were used in this sort of secretive language along the Underground Railroad. So one of those metaphors is a metaphor for station master. Station master. A station master literally would be the person in charge of a train station. Okay? Person in charge of the train station. Metaphorically, the station master was the homeowner or the person who offered safety. Sometimes it could have been a business owner, could have been a farmer and offering a barn, so not always a home. But station master became, for those who knew the special language, a metaphor that meant a safe, the homeowner of a safe place. Another one of those code words was a code word for the word line. Of course, we're not talking about a literal line that you draw here. And with relation to the railroad, literally a line is a train route that has regular stops along it, So just like you would have with a metro in a city, you would take certain lines to arrive at certain stops. Same with a train. Metaphorically, for the Underground Railroad, the line was the suggested route to the next safe shelter, okay? So if the homeowner used the word line, he might say to the slave, you're going to follow such and such line. It will take you past, these various landmarks. Landmarks would be certain very visible things that the slave might see along the way, and the homeowner would tell them, what the line was going to look like, what kinds of things they might see along the way until they got to the next safe place. All right, and then we know that the slaves were referred to as passengers. Of course, literally, a passenger is one who rides along in some sort of transport vehicle. Metaphorically, then, a passenger was a slave on the move. So a homeowner could get a message saying, you have 3 passengers arriving today. And that homeowner would know that there were slaves coming and that they needed to be ready and prepared with a place to hide them, food for them, supplies, necessities to help them. All right. Another word is depot. A train depot is kind of another word for station, train station, and we have a lot of depots in the United States that are not used anymore but are still standing because of their historical significance, some even dating back to the days of the Underground Railroad. Some of these old depots have been transformed into shops or restaurants or businesses, city landmarks, that kind of thing. So literally, a depot is a train station or stop. Metaphorically, for the Underground Railroad, the depot was a safe house or shelter on the escape route. So your home would be referred to as a depot, metaphorically, if you were taking care of escaped slaves. And then the word conductor. I think I told you the other day that a conductor was literally the person in charge, or is literally a person who's in charge of a train. Okay, they do a variety of things, and in some cases they might actually be involved in driving, and that's less common. In much earlier times it might have been a little more common. Now they kind of manage all of the things along the train and take care of all sorts of aspects in managing the people who work on the train and so forth. Okay? Metaphorically, though, the conductor of the Underground Railroad would have been a person who orchestrated the escape. So it wouldn't always be the same conductor. It would be different conductors who would be orchestrating the escape of different groups of slaves who were traveling together. And different people would sort of take the lead in orchestrating the route for those people, because obviously that route would have to change. Certainly if the route were the same all the time, or the routes were the same all the time, then the what were called the bounty hunters and I will explain that word a little bit more carefully, but the bounty hunters would catch on. They would know that, you know, these are the homes along the route, and we can probably find slaves hidden in these homes. So whoever orchestrated this would have to find a variety of homes and places and keep it mixed up so that the bounty hunters couldn't determine exactly where the slaves might be hiding at any given time. Now, the bounty hunters, the word bounty usually has to do with a price, okay? A reward. So if you were a bounty hunter, you were trying to find certain slaves, any slaves for that matter, but sometimes you would have a description of one or two or three particular slaves who might be traveling together. And you would have a description of how they looked and what their clothing was and how tall they were and whether they were male or female and all of this. And you would be given a very large bounty or prize if you could bring that slave to the slave owner or to the legal folks, what would have been the police at that time, but they were called different things at that time in history. They weren't really called police. Sheriff, marshal are some words that might describe the people who would be in charge of keeping law and order. And so if you could bring a slave in, then you might become very wealthy. And so some people did only that for many years. That was their profession. That's what kept them living and having food for their families, was to capture slaves. So not a very notable profession to be in my opinion. But those were the bounty hunters. All right, let's take a look then at the events that let's see if I can slide this back a little further. At the events that you read about that helped to give us a timeline of the Underground Railroad. We know that there were, for many decades, slaves who were escaping to freedom. From the time that the first colonies were established here in the United States, and the first slaves were brought in, we know that those who were mistreated began to want freedom. That's just a natural instinct, isn't it? Now, we talked in class a little bit about indentured slaves or indentured servants. Indentured servants were a little different than slaves. Slavery really it denotes ownership, okay? And if you are a slave, you have really no rights. Anything that you have, any good treatment that you receive is considered more or less a gift out of the goodness of the heart of the slave owner. Whereas an indentured servant is working for a homeowner in exchange for certain privileges, certain goods. So an indentured servant is or would have been a better thing to be, okay? Those who were really in slavery and who were mistreated have always sought freedom all through history, no matter how far back you go. But here in the United States would have been all through the 1700s, of course, as the United States began to form as the colonies began to come together and form a union. It wasn't until 1834 that slaves began to feel a little more empowered. The Slavery Abolition Act was passed in the British Empire, and even though Great Britain did not have control over a number of the states within the United States because of the Revolutionary War and the United States gaining freedom from Great Britain, still there was influence from Great Britain, and still, of course, there was a lot of communication that occurred, and the word got around that this act had been passed in Great Britain, and it applied to the entire British Empire, and it was to abolish slavery, no matter where around the world it might be. If you were an entity of land and you were controlled by the British Empire, then you were not to have slaves any longer. That sort of made the slaves within the states here in the United States feel empowered, and they began to seek freedom even more earnestly. Earnestly means with even more passion. They were emboldened to escape further north. They began to think, okay, well, if we can't get freedom in the South, and then if we don't feel fully free in the northern states, we will keep going. And many of them continued upwards into Canada. In 1850, in the United States, a law was passed by Congress called the Fugitive Act. The Fugitive Act said that slaves could be captured legally and returned to their slave owners legally, and whatever treatment the slave owners chose to use to punish them, no one would really pay attention. So the Fugitive Act gave power back to the slave owners, and it gave power to the bounty hunters to go out and to try to capture escapees. Between 1850 and 1861, the escapees continued to move further and further north as best they could do under circumstances of great difficulty, weather, health, safety, all of those things. And remember that many of these slaves were moving independent of their families. They left their families behind to go, and with the promise of, I will find a way to bring you to me. Or sometimes the family would go, and perhaps the leader of the family, whether it be the father or the mother, would stay and would accept their fate. They would tell their family, you go, you be safe, you be happy and healthy. I will stay, and I will accept whatever punishment I may be given for sending you away. In 1861, the Civil War broke out in the United States. The northern states became known as the armies for the northern states became known as the Union armies, and the armies for the southern states became known as the Confederate armies. And we know that the Civil War lasted for close to 5 years, from 1861 to 1865. Thousands and thousands and thousands of individuals lost their lives. During the time of the Civil War, we found many former slaves who had escaped and joined up with the North. They joined up with the North to fight along with the Northern Army, the Union Army, to bring about an end to slavery. So slaves themselves, former slaves, joined the effort. And finally, it wasn't until 1865 that the 13th Amendment was passed in the United States. The greatest credit goes to Abraham Lincoln, who was president at that time and who was president throughout the Civil War, and who felt so very strongly about this issue that he was willing to really build his entire presidency around this issue. And a study of Abraham Lincoln is fascinating on many levels, because he was a very amazing individual, but his passion about freeing slaves is what really drove his presidency the entire time. And the 13th Amendment finally guaranteed that freedom. It was slow after that. A lot of people who were slave owners didn't really want to cooperate, and were slow as far as getting on board, we might say, with this whole idea. But it was a gradual thing. Yet today, you will still have, and for many years, you will have situations where many African Americans feel that even though slavery was abolished, that full rights have never been honored. And it did take time for the United States to give African American people the right to go to school, the right to then later go to school in mixed classrooms, rights having to do with voting and other things. So it's, America's battle with racial equality is a long and difficult one. All right, I've gone over time. I'm going to stop. Thank you so much.